Chapter 1. The Unlikely Encounter. The stars stretched out in front of Jonathan Harris like a glittering sea, vast and endless, offering both comfort and solitude in equal measure. The worn, battle-scarred hull of his ship, the Voyager, creaked beneath him as it drifted silently through the blackness of space, far away from the noise and chaos of any major civilization. Jonathan had always preferred it this way, remote, quiet, and uninhabited. He wasn't a man for much human interaction, his life revolving around trade routes and repairing ships across the galaxy. He was a mechanic by trade, a spacer by necessity, and a wanderer by choice. It had always been enough to keep him occupied, and after years of working alone, he had come to find peace in that isolation. He had no family, no attachments, nothing that would weigh him down, no one to miss him and no one for him to miss. That was the way he liked it. His routine had been one of quiet routine, day after day. He repaired engines, navigated through systems, and delivered his cargo with the same mechanical precision that he applied to his work. It was nothing extravagant. He wasn't a smuggler. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't part of any galactic faction. He was just a man doing a job. The ships he worked on were often old, their crews rough and unremarkable, their destinations unimportant. For Jonathan, the work was simply a means to an end. He was the kind of man who didn't care for anything grand or dramatic. His world was small, confined to the greasy interior of the Voyager, the hum of its engines, and the constant shuffle of moving from one job to the next. But that, too, was about to change. It all started one quiet evening, when the comm system, which he had long ago stopped paying attention to, suddenly blinked with life. At first, Jonathan thought it was just the usual static interference, a simple signal lost in the space between worlds. But then the message repeated, clear and urgent, and his hands froze over the ship's controls. The message was direct, compelling him to take action. It had no origin, no name attached to it, and it wasn't even broadcast from any known system. The words were simple, but they struck him with a sense of foreboding, as if they carried a weight he couldn't understand. Help us. You are needed. Please come to the coordinates enclosed. There is no time to explain further. Jonathan rubbed his eyes, not sure if he was seeing things or if the fatigue of traveling had finally caught up with him. The words hung in the air as if they were meant for him, but no one else. His heart beat just a little faster, a wave of uncertainty washing over him. He stared at the coordinates that flashed on the screen, a series of numbers and symbols that seemed out of place in the vastness of space. It was a remote part of the galaxy one he had never ventured into. In fact, it was an area known for being barren, far away from trade routes, uncharted and unexplored. It wasn't a place people went unless they had a reason, and the idea that someone would seek him out there, with such a vague and cryptic message, felt both strange and dangerous. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. He didn't know anyone anything. He wasn't a hero, nor did he want to be. The message could easily be a trick, a waste of time. After all, space was full of desperate individuals looking for help, some of them using trickery or false transmissions to get what they wanted. Yet, deep down, Jonathan felt a strange pull toward the coordinates, an unexplainable curiosity that gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the isolation that had made him restless. Perhaps it was the promise of something new, something different, that drew him in. Maybe it was just the voice in his head telling him he couldn't ignore it, that it was too important to pass by. Whatever it was enough to convince him. With a sigh, Jonathan set the course for the mysterious coordinates. He didn't know who had sent the message or what kind of trouble he might be walking into, but there was no turning back now. The stars ahead of him seemed to stretch farther, inviting him into the unknown, as the ship's engines roared to life and the controls hummed in response. His instincts told him it was a risk. Every part of his experience told him that these kinds of things rarely ended well, but for some reason, his gut told him that this time, it was different. The journey was long, the silence of the ship only broken by the rhythmic hum of the engines as they moved through the deep void of space. As the hours turned into days, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what awaited him at the coordinates. His thoughts drifted to his quiet life, the simplicity of his existence, and the unease that began to creep into his chest. Was this a mistake? Was he walking into something far beyond what he could handle? Eventually, he arrived at the designated coordinates, but there was nothing there. No signal, no other ships, just the vast emptiness of space. The void stretched out before him like an endless sea, and Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as his mind tried to process the information in front of him. He had arrived, but there was nothing to show for it. No signs of any distress, no ships or signals. It seemed like an empty space. Maybe a glitch, a malfunction, a trick. His finger hovered over the control to leave, to turn around and abandon whatever foolish hope he had that there was something here worth finding. And yet, something stopped him. A shape emerged from the darkness. Something moving slowly and deliberately, an object almost too large to comprehend at first. It was a ship, a massive, sleek vessel, its hull gleaming in the dim light of the distant star, yet dark and ominous in its presence. The ship was clearly in distress, its surface marked with damage and wear, but it was still functional, or so it seemed. His heart pounded as he brought the ship alongside it, his hands moving quickly over the controls. This was no ordinary vessel. He could sense it, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It was a ship unlike anything he had ever encountered, its markings strange, its technology advanced, and yet unmistakably alien. He had stumbled upon something much bigger than he had anticipated. The comm system crackled to life, and a voice came through, soft, hesitant, yet full of urgency. "You came," it said, the words barely audible but clear enough to send a shiver down his spine. "Please, help us." Jonathan's grip tightened on the controls as his eyes scanned the ship before him. He couldn't make out much more than its shape, but there was no doubt about it now. This was where the message had originated. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was alone, in uncharted space, facing an alien vessel in distress with no idea what he was about to walk into. And yet, something within him, something primal, urged him to act. He activated the docking procedure. Jonathan didn't know what to think at first. His hand hovered over the comm console, his mind wrestling with the gravity of what he had just heard. The message had been so vague, so direct, and now that he was here, aboard this strange vessel, everything seemed more surreal. His boots echoed softly against the metal flooring as he moved deeper into the ship, trying to make sense of the overwhelming silence that enveloped him. There was no crew, no signs of life, just the deep hum of the ship's systems as it powered on, slowly but steadily. Yet, there was an undeniable presence here, something he could feel pressing against him, making the air seem thick and heavy. The ship itself felt alive, as though it was waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. He had been hired for simple mechanic work, to repair a freighter that was barely operational, but now he found himself tangled in something far more complicated. This wasn't a ship that needed a simple repair. This was a vessel carrying something much bigger, something important. He didn't know what yet, but he knew that his arrival here had not been a coincidence. There was something about this message, about the strange pull he felt toward this unknown world, that made him feel like a part of a much larger story, one that was unfolding in front of him. As he walked, his senses heightened, trying to pick up any sign of danger, any clue as to what he was walking into. The walls of the ship were lined with unfamiliar symbols and alien text that danced across the surface like intricate patterns. There was technology here that far surpassed anything he had encountered in his travels. He had seen advanced ships before, but this was something else. It wasn't just a ship. It was a statement, a legacy, perhaps. The deeper he ventured, the more apparent it became that this wasn't just a random ship drifting through space. This was a ship that had purpose, a mission. Whether it was an accidental discovery or fate, he couldn't say, but something inside him stirred, a sense of unease mixed with curiosity, drawing him forward as if it were leading him to the answers he never expected. And then, as though on cue, the ship's lights flickered before stabilizing, casting a soft blue glow throughout the corridor. He moved forward cautiously, every step calculated. It was then that he noticed something, a sound. A soft hum, almost melodic, coming from behind a large metal door that stood ahead of him. The sound was so faint at first that he thought it was just part of the ship's engines, but the closer he got, the clearer it became. There was something alive behind that door. Something or someone. He reached the door and hesitated for a moment before placing his hand on the cold metal. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a large, circular room bathed in soft light. And standing in the center, illuminated by that strange glow, was a woman. A tall figure with striking features, alien, yet unmistakably humanoid. Her skin had a faint luminescent sheen, pale but with a subtle glow that made her look almost otherworldly. Her long, Flowing hair shimmered silver in the soft lighting, and her eyes, those eyes, were the most captivating thing about her. They were bright, almost glowing, with a piercing intensity that made Jonathan's breath catch in his chest. They were filled with emotion, fear, hope, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Are you the one who received the message?" she asked softly, her voice melodic but tinged with an urgency that made Jonathan's heart race. "I did," he replied cautiously, still trying to comprehend what was happening. "I'm here now. What do you need?" Her gaze softened, and she stepped forward, revealing a small child standing beside her. The child was unlike anything Jonathan had ever seen. Its skin was not like any human child he had encountered. It had small, delicate features and large eyes that reflected the same strange light as its mother. It looked fragile, almost too delicate for this world. "We need your help," she said, her voice now quieter, almost pleading. "My child and I, we're running from something. From someone. We need protection, and we have nowhere else to turn." Jonathan's mind raced. This was no ordinary encounter. The emotions in her voice were raw, filled with desperation and fear. His instincts told him to be cautious, but his curiosity and a sense of something deeper compelled him to listen. "What do you mean? Who are you running from?" Her gaze shifted down, and the sadness in her eyes deepened. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "But I need your help. We have nowhere else to go, and we are bound by a fate that we cannot escape. You have been chosen, Jonathan Harris. You are the only one who can help us." Before he could process her words, she stepped closer, and there was something about her presence that made his heart skip a beat. The woman, despite her fear, held herself with an undeniable power, an ancient strength that Jonathan could sense beneath her fragile exterior. There was a quiet strength in her, a kind of force that made him realize she was no ordinary traveler lost in the vastness of space. She was more than that. "Why me?" Jonathan asked, his voice a mixture of skepticism and confusion. "I'm just a mechanic. I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't have to understand everything," she replied, her voice still soft but full of conviction. "But I need you to take me and my child with you. We cannot stay here any longer. Our enemies are closing in. They know we are here." Jonathan stood there, processing the request. His logical mind told him to refuse. This wasn't his problem, and he had no business getting involved in whatever dangerous game this alien woman was playing. But a part of him, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, to the mysteries that space seemed to offer at every turn, knew that saying no would be impossible. There was something about her, something about the situation, that resonated with him in ways he couldn't fully explain. He took a deep breath, glancing at the small child beside her, its big eyes staring up at him with silent pleading. Something in those eyes tugged at his heart. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice softer now, less guarded. "I want you to take us with you. I want you to protect us," she replied, her tone now resolute. "We have nowhere else to go. I have nothing left." The weight of her words hit him hard. Jonathan's mind raced. He had always considered himself a man of simple solutions, someone who fixed things and moved on. But this was different. This wasn't a broken ship or a malfunctioning engine. This was a woman and a child, two lives thrust upon him, asking for his help in a way he couldn't ignore. "You're asking me to take you and your child as my concubine?" Jonathan asked, the words sounding strange even to his own ears. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was definitely not it. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "Yes," she said simply. "You are the one we need. I know it is an unusual request, but it is the only way." Jonathan's heart raced as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. Concubine? The request felt foreign, almost absurd, yet the sincerity in her eyes told him it was not a decision made lightly. She was offering herself and her child to him, trusting him in ways that he couldn't yet understand. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice filled with a mixture of confusion and intrigue. "Why me of all people?" "Because you are the one who will take us where we need to go," she answered softly. "You are the only one who can help us escape what is coming." Jonathan felt a sense of responsibility stir within him, though he was still unsure of everything that was unfolding. He had no idea what the future held, what kind of danger they were running from, but one thing was certain. He couldn't just walk away. There was no turning back now. Chapter 2. A Decision Made. The silence that followed hung thick between them, the weight of the woman's request lingering in the air like a dense fog. Jonathan stood there, trying to make sense of what he had just been asked. He was no stranger to danger, no stranger to risk. He had survived in the underbelly of the galaxy for years, where everything was a transaction, where lives were worth less than the cargo in his hold. But this was different. The woman's plea, the child's eyes, the feeling of being pulled into something bigger than himself, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But it felt like the universe was making him choose. As he stared at her, her gaze unwavering, he realized that saying no wasn't an option. There was something here, something he couldn't fully understand, but he could feel it deep in his bones. "I'll help you," Jonathan said finally, the words coming out with a weight he hadn't expected. "But I need to know more. What's going on? Who's chasing you? And why me?" The woman nodded, her eyes softening, as if relieved by his response. "I will explain everything. But first, we must leave. The longer we stay here, the more danger we face." Jonathan took a deep breath. The decision had been made, whether he was ready for it or not. He turned and walked toward the airlock, motioning for her to follow. It was time to go. Time to face the unknown. The woman moved gracefully, her alien features seemingly at ease in the metallic environment of Jonathan's ship. As she and the child followed him toward the airlock, Jonathan could feel the weight of their presence like an unspoken bond forming between them. There was a sense of quiet urgency about the way she carried herself, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows, as though she was afraid someone might be watching, waiting for her to slip up. Jonathan wasn't sure what kind of enemies she was running from, but the fear in her eyes told him that whatever it wasn't something easily escaped. Her story had begun to unfold, but it was still only a fragment, a brief glimpse into a larger, more dangerous narrative. He could sense that what was happening here, in this very moment, was just the beginning. His thoughts kept racing, questions piling on top of one another. Who were these enemies? Why was she asking him, a simple mechanic of all people, to take her and her child as his concubine? The words still felt strange on his lips, and he couldn't shake the odd feeling that lingered in the air, like a lingering echo of something ancient. He didn't understand it, but he felt something powerful, something primal, stirring inside him as he led them to the airlock. Something that told him the universe had plans for him, plans he wasn't yet prepared for. The airlock hissed as it opened, the cold vacuum of space stretching before them. Jonathan motioned for the woman and child to follow him aboard the ship, stepping aside as they entered the cockpit. The child, who had been quiet this whole time, now clung to its mother, looking up at Jonathan with wide, curious eyes. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, it being so fragile, yet so intense, as if it carried an unspoken weight within its gaze. He knew that the decision he had just made was monumental, but there was no going back now. They were in this together, and he wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain. His life was never going to be the same. "I'll get us out of here," Jonathan said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty he felt. "But we need to leave quickly. I don't know who's after you, but I have a feeling we're not alone out here. They might already be tracking us." The woman nodded, her eyes focused, steady. "Thank you, Jonathan Harris. You don't know how much this means to me." He didn't respond immediately. His focus was on the controls, his hands moving expertly over the console, setting the course for the nearest spaceport, where he hoped he could figure out what to do next. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many gaps in the story. Who was she? Why was she asking him to take her and her child as a concubine? What exactly were they running from? But all of that could wait. For now, their immediate goal was to get out of the immediate danger zone. As he maneuvered the ship out of the hangar, the hum of the engines resonated in his chest, the ship's familiar rumble offering a small amount of comfort. But as they cleared the atmosphere and entered the vastness of space, that comfort was quickly replaced with a heavy sense of apprehension. The dark expanse before them was filled with possibilities, but also with an undeniable danger. The woman's presence, the strange request, the child, all of it was part of something much bigger than Jonathan could fully understand. "So," Jonathan said, after a long moment of silence, glancing over at the woman, who had settled into the co-pilot seat beside him. "What's going on? What do I need to know?" She turned her gaze toward him, the seriousness in her eyes unwavering. "I'm part of a much larger conflict, Jonathan. My people are hunted, exiled, and wiped out. My child and I are the last of our kind, our species, to be exact. We were forced to flee when our world was overrun, and we've been in hiding ever since." Jonathan's fingers hovered over the control panel as he processed her words, his mind struggling to catch up. "Overrun? By who?" The woman's gaze hardened, her voice dropping lower, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. By the Azari, a ruthless faction who believes they have the right to annihilate every species that doesn't conform to their ideology. They've wiped out my people, and we are the last survivors of a once powerful civilization. Now, they're hunting us, hunting me and my child. Jonathan's mind spun. The Azari. He had heard of them before, whispers in dark corners of spaceports, stories of their fanatical pursuits of conquest. The thought of them hunting a woman and her child, exterminating an entire species for no reason other than ideological supremacy, made his blood boil. And you want me to help you? Jonathan said slowly, as the pieces began to fall into place. You want me to take you and your child as my concubine to protect you from these Azari? The woman's face softened for a moment, and she looked down at her child, the tender touch of her hand brushing against the small being's delicate features. Yes, but it's more than just protection. You don't understand. There is a greater reason why I've come to you, Jonathan. You have something they want, something they've been searching for. Jonathan's head spun. What could I possibly have that they want? She met his gaze, her eyes intense. You are not just a mechanic, Jonathan. You are a key. You have something inside you, something your people have kept hidden for generations. And the Azari are searching for it. If they find you, if they find what you carry, they will stop at nothing to take it. The words sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. He wasn't sure what she meant, what it was that made him special, but one thing was certain. He had just been thrown into something much larger than himself. The weight of her words felt like a shackle, pulling him deeper into the chaos. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan realized that his actions weren't just about survival anymore. They were about something greater. Something that could change the fate of not only his life, but the entire galaxy. Chapter 3. The Burden of Knowledge. The journey through deep space had been filled with uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional hum of the ship's engines and the soft murmurings of the woman as she comforted her child. Jonathan's mind raced as the enormity of her words weighed heavily on him. What did she mean? That he had something the Azari wanted. He wasn't anyone important. He was just a mechanic, a simple man trying to make his way through a galaxy full of chaos. Yet, here he was, caught in the midst of something far beyond his understanding, pulled into a war he hadn't even known existed. As the days passed, Jonathan spent most of his time in the cockpit, steering the ship toward the rendezvous point she had given him. But every time he glanced over at her, his mind reeled with questions. The more he thought about it, the less he understood. He had never been one to delve into the mysteries of the universe. He was a man of practicality, of tangible things he could fix and understand. But this was something different. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was now entangled in a web of secrets, with no clear way out. One evening, as they neared the designated space station where they were to meet an ally of hers, Jonathan turned to her, his voice heavy with frustration. You still haven't told me what you meant. What is it that I have that the Azari want? I'm just a mechanic. I'm not involved in any of this. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with an odd mixture of sadness and resolve. You may be a mechanic, Jonathan, but you are far more than that. Your people humans are the key to everything. You have something within you, something your ancestors have hidden for centuries. It is a power, a knowledge, that the Azari have been hunting for. They believe that if they possess it, they will have ultimate control over the galaxy. Jonathan stood still, his heart pounding as the words sank in. What kind of power are you talking about? What could I possibly have? She stood up from her seat, walking over to him, her expression softening as she took a deep breath. You're part of an ancient lineage, Jonathan. A lineage that was once connected to an ancient force and energy that has the power to change the very fabric of reality. The Azari want that power. They want to control it, to bend it to their will. And you are the last piece of the puzzle. Jonathan felt his mind spinning. This was too much. A power, a lineage. The Azari, he wasn't even sure what she was talking about, but everything in him screamed that it was real, that it was happening, and that he was in far deeper than he had ever imagined. He had always lived his life in the background, fixing things and moving on. But now, everything had changed. His life wasn't just about surviving anymore. He was a key player in something much larger, something he had no choice but to understand. What do we do? Jonathan asked, his voice hoarse, filled with an uncertainty that he couldn't hide. How do we stop them? She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. We fight. We survive. and we find the answers before it's too late. As Jonathan looked out into the infinite blackness of space, the realization hit him with full force. His life was no longer his own. The decisions he made from this point forward would not just affect him, but the fate of an entire galaxy. Jonathan stared at the stars outside the cockpit, his mind still grappling with the enormity of what the alien woman had told him. There was no way to comprehend all of it at once. His thoughts bounced between disbelief and the weight of responsibility that now sat on his shoulders. The woman whose name, he learned, was part of a race that had once wielded an ancient and powerful energy, an energy that the Azari, the relentless force she had spoken of, were desperate to control. The more Jonathan heard, the more it seemed like the galaxy he knew was nothing like the galaxy that Alara and her people had once inhabited. The ancient forces, hidden knowledge, and forgotten powers were all coming to the surface, and Jonathan, just an unremarkable mechanic from a remote outpost, was caught in the middle of it. As Alara attended to her child in the back of the ship, Jonathan continued to pilot the vessel towards their destination, the coordinates she had provided leading them to a seemingly ordinary space station on the outskirts of a more populated star system. The station was neutral territory, used for trade and transiting, but Alara had insisted it was the safest place to rendezvous with her allies, the ones who would help them escape the Azari's grasp. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Every moment in his life had been predictable until now. Now, it seemed like he had been thrust into a conflict he couldn't fully understand, with no way to turn back. Jonathan had always been a man who thrived on simplicity. The engines, the gears, the mechanics, those were things he could fix, things he could control. But this was a puzzle that didn't have an easy solution, and the stakes were far greater than he had ever anticipated. He wasn't just fixing a broken ship anymore. He was a part of something much bigger. He was part of a story that would shape the future, and somehow, Alara had made him believe that he was meant to play a role in it. As the ship neared the station, the soft hum of the engines filled the cockpit. Jonathan adjusted his trajectory, trying to push the ever-growing feeling of dread away. His hand moved instinctively over the control panel as he prepared to dock with the station, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he glanced at Alara, her eyes seemed to carry an unspoken message, as if she was silently pleading with him to accept what was happening, to accept her request. He had agreed to help them, but he still didn't understand why. Why had she come to him? What was it about him that made him the chosen one, the one who could carry this power inside him? There were too many unanswered questions, and as the docking bay doors of the station finally slid open, Jonathan knew the answers might be closer than he had ever expected. The station was crowded, with all kinds of species and travelers passing through. He had seen it before, a bustling center of commerce, a place where everything was for sale, and everyone had a purpose. But there was a sense of danger in the air now, a tension that had been building ever since the moment Alara had appeared in his life. They were being watched, Jonathan could feel it. There were eyes on them, and the closer they got to their destination, the more palpable the sense of danger became. "Is this the place?" Jonathan asked, turning to Alara as they began to move through the crowded station. "Yes," she replied softly, but there was something in her voice that unsettled him. Her gaze flickered around the station, as if looking for something or someone. A group of traders passed by, their faces obscured by scarves and helmets. They were the usual type, unremarkable, blending in with the rest of the station's crowd. But as they moved past, Jonathan caught a glimpse of one of them looking directly at Alara, their gaze lingering for a split second longer than was normal. A cold chill ran down Jonathan's spine. He wasn't imagining it, something was off. He could feel the tension in the air, and his instincts told him they weren't alone. "They're here," Alara whispered, barely audible above the noise of the station. She grabbed his arm, her grip tight and urgent. "The Azari. They found us." Before Jonathan could react, the hum of the station's artificial gravity system shifted, the lights flickering for a brief moment, and the sounds of the crowded hallway seemed to go dead. It was like a switch had been flipped. People froze. A sudden wave of panic surged through the crowd, and in that moment, Jonathan knew they were surrounded. The Azari were here. "Stay close," Alara said, her voice sharp, her eyes scanning the crowd. "We need to move quickly. We don't have much time." Jonathan's mind was racing. The Azari. He had heard rumors, whispers in dark corners of spaceport stories about their brutal, unforgiving conquest of entire civilizations, wiping out entire species without hesitation. He hadn't believed it at the time. It had seemed like one of those far-off threats that would never reach him. But now, with Alara's urgency and the cold, calculating fear in her eyes, he realized the truth. They were not some distant legend. They were real, and they were coming for her. The crowd parted as a group of armored figures approached. Their black, sleek exosuits glistened in the dim lighting of the station, their faces hidden behind dark visors. The leader of the group stepped forward, and Jonathan's heart sank. He recognized the insignia on the soldier's chest as Ari. He had seen it in the texts, in the scattered news broadcasts. These were not mercenaries. These were soldiers of an empire. Alara, the leader said in a voice that seemed to echo in the quiet chaos. You cannot escape. You are a relic of the past. Surrender now. Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was at the moment they had been running from, the moment where everything changed. The Azari were here, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Get down, Alara shouted, pulling Jonathan to the side as the Azari soldiers advanced. Without thinking, Jonathan dropped to the floor, instinctively reaching for his blaster. He had never been a soldier, but years of travel had taught him the basics of self-defense. As he took cover behind a nearby column, the sound of weapons charging filled the air. They won't stop, Alara whispered to him, her hand gripping his arm. We have to make it to the ship. If they get their hands on me, it's over. Jonathan nodded, his mind racing. There was no time for hesitation. They had to move. They had to leave now. With Alara and her child in tow, he sprinted toward the nearest exit, dodging between the crowd and avoiding the soldiers' line of sight. The station had become a war zone in the blink of an eye. People screamed, running in every direction, but Jonathan didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The hallway was narrow, winding. He could hear the Azari behind them, their footsteps heavy and methodical as they closed in. The closer they got to the ship, the more desperate the situation became. They couldn't let the Azari catch up. If they did, there would be no way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the docking bay where the Voyager awaited. Jonathan hit the control panel, and the ship's hatch opened with a low hiss, the airlock allowing them entry. He pushed Alara and her child up the ramp, his heart pounding as he ran back to the controls. Strap in, he shouted as the ship's engines roared to life. The moment the doors sealed behind them, he punched in the coordinates for their escape route. The Azari soldiers had reached the bay, but Jonathan didn't look back. The ship was already lifting off, soaring through the station's exit at full throttle. Alara, still clutching her child, looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear. You did it, she said, her voice soft but filled with disbelief. We're free. Jonathan didn't respond. His hands were locked on the controls, his focus split between flying and the overwhelming realization that their fight had just begun. The Azari wouldn't stop, not now, not ever. And whatever secrets he carried inside him, they would come for them all. The journey ahead would not be easy, but Jonathan had made his choice. And now, there was no turning back. Chapter 4. A New Destiny. The stars stretched out before them, endless and silent, as the Voyager made its way deeper into uncharted space. Jonathan sat at the helm, the hum of the ship's engines beneath him, the weight of the journey pressing on his shoulders. Alara sat beside him, holding her child tightly, her eyes distant, as if she were still trying to process everything that had happened. We can't stop, she said softly, breaking the silence. They will follow us. They won't stop until they find us. Jonathan nodded grimly, his eyes never leaving the controls. I know, he muttered. But we have time. We're not running anymore. We're fighting. The stars outside blinked as they sped through the endless dark, the ship carrying them further and further from the station, from the Azari, from everything they had known. It was a new beginning, but also the beginning of a long and dangerous road. Jonathan didn't know where it would lead them, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the mechanics of his ship and the simple life he had lived before. The galaxy was vast, but they were no longer alone in it. And that, for better or worse, meant everything had changed.